Okay. So now we're looking at literary analysis of the passage utilizing one of the documents that is in the Unit 9 weekly handouts. The bottom one, I think, in the first batch of handouts, literary analysis revision of 24 October. And that's the one that we're going to be looking at together in this section. So step one is to, of course, work at translation. That I really kind of skipped over that, but this is going on the basis of an assumption that you have translated your passage already, that you're going to be exegeting for your major paper in the end. Literary and characterization studies will fold over into your final exegetical paper, where you will include these materials, the important findings of these analyses into your final exegetical paper. When we get closer to the end of the semester, I'll talk more about the exegetical paper, but literary analysis is foundational after you've translated your passage to looking at how the author, narrator, Moses, so forth, through history. We look at any narrative passage in the biblical text. Here's how we get at the meaning. You do your basic translation, then you start looking for the various types of what we call rhetorical devices. Looking at the text to see how different portions of the narrative, different portions of the story that is being presented in the text, how these different elements fit together. And so this step one after translation includes looking at probably the most well-known, widely used from ancient times until today, that of repetition. Repetitious elements, sometimes it's a repetition of a word, sometimes it's a phrase, sometimes it's a theme, but other times you might repeat. We use a lot in popular English preaching, alliteration, starting all of our major points with the same letter or phrase. And sometimes in Hebrew, that'll do the same thing with endings. One of the repetitious elements, for example, in Psalm 23, when you read through the Hebrew text of Psalm 23, the endings, the first person singular endings, as we would translate it, the Lord is my shepherd, Adonai Ro'i, Lo Exar, I shall not want. It goes on to repeat numerous Hirik Yod endings, the first person common suffix. A couple years ago, actually about 15 years ago, I taught a Psalms class in Hebrew, and in that Psalms class, I had the students memorize Psalm 23 in Hebrew. And some students struggle to memorize it, and then you have to say it before the class. But every now and then you'll get a really very innovative pair of students or individual who will do something like, let's see, the last time I did this a year ago, one of our students sang it accompanied by her ukulele. But back, I think it was in like 2003, I had a couple of students who went on, by the way, to do PhD in preaching. You may know the names of Tony Merida, who has done some teaching at Southeastern Seminary, and Landon Dowden did this Psalm 23 in rap. And every time they came to those Hirik Yod endings, he would elevate his voice. So it would go something like, Tony did the background, Landon did the recitation of the psalm, and so Tony's in the background doing this kind of syncopated rhythm, doing a little cha-ching, ka-ching, 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 kind of thing. And Landon's doing Adonai Ro'i, Lo Exar, Minod Deshe Yad B'Tzei. And so he would do that over and over. So different ways that repetition is used, different elements, words, individual words, different forms or endings, different phrases, but repetition is one of the most commonly used rhetorical elements. Again, Rhetoric has to do with the means by which we make our points, whether it's teaching, presenting a sermon, whatever kind of oration that we're doing. Repetition is very common. The second one on the list is the use of chiasm, or the longer form chiasmus. That is a way of presenting a story that moves toward a pivotal point. So chiasm comes from the Greek chi, which is, of course, your X-looking form. And in the chiasm, you begin and you end with either the same elements or very similar elements. In the material that I posted up at the beginning of the semester, I did this outline of the Solomonic material of 1 Kings 1 to 11. The king's presentation of the reign of Solomon that begins with the struggle for Solomon's reign with his half-brother Adonijah, and it ends with the struggle to maintain the kingdom after Solomon has rebelled, the beginning of chapter 11, and then the latter part of chapter 11, which is the match for the beginning of chapters 1 to 11 in 1 Kings, has to do with the collapse of the kingdom, the rebellion of various people groups that his father, King David, had conquered. And each of these various elements in that outline have a parallel. So you have like part 1, and then you have 1 prime, part 2, 2 prime. Get out of here. This thing that came up out of the blue. What in the world is that?
I think hit your Windows button again.
There we go. So a chiasmus move, but the overall function, again, chiasm doesn't occur everywhere. Sometimes it's in a minor section within a passage. Sometimes, like I said, with the 1 Kings 1 to 11, it's a chiastic structure that bridges 11 chapters of that portion of Kings in the presentation of Solomon, with the pivotal point being Solomon's ego, and that ego as it's manifest in the multiplication of wives, and in particular that which began with the marriage to the daughter of Pharaoh, and how that the author of 1 Kings 1 to 11 put at the pivotal point Solomon's struggle with women. Started out in chapter 3, climaxes in chapter 11, but the turning point is that in the middle of the building of the temple, Solomon has a problem about his own ego. He builds a palace that takes almost twice as long to build as his own temple, and he's building a palace for his Egyptian wife. All of that is to show that in the mind of God as represented in the purpose of the writing of the book of Kings, in this particular portion, to remind the reader, as Deuteronomy 17, the issues of kingship are presented, Solomon failed in his involvement with Egypt, which Egypt was off limits, according to Deuteronomy 17, for kings. And as you follow that theme through the books of Kings, for example, and it comes up in a much lesser emphasis in Chronicles, but it's still there, foreign involvements, whether it's with the Egyptians or Phoenicians, as in the marriage of Omri's son Ahab to Jezebel, the daughter of the king priest of Phoenicia. These international involvements are keys to the demise, understanding why Israel collapsed continuously into idolatry, and eventually God forced the issue, as he had promised in the curses of Deuteronomy, to bring exile. But God always plans to bring redemption. So again, chiasmus can be on a large scale or it can be on a small scale, but repetition would go back, for example, as I've talked about, these foreign involvements, again, are one of the major themes that runs throughout the King's material. In Genesis, of course, we've highlighted covenant. We've also highlighted the repetition element of the recurrence of Abraham. Later on, we'll see the same with Jacob in particular, failures to be entirely in sync with God's plan. And so various ways in which repetition and chiasmus are interwoven throughout the text. Sometimes you have parallel structures, whereas chiasm moves to a point, there will be repetition of parallel structures. Now, in the narrative article that I had you read, I talk about how narrative is presented, and often it's repeated in phases. So part one may be kind of an introductory foundational studies. I used the example in that narrative article of the Day of Atonement. It begins with a historical setting, reminder this is serious business because the failure to follow God's instruction may lead to death, as it did for Aaron's sons, Nadav and Abihu. And then it presents, here are the basic elements that are going to be utilized in the sacrificial day of the Day of Atonement. The next part is going to extrapolate and tell you why several of those elements that are presented in part one are utilized. So it's kind of a growing, like concentric circles of expansion of the narrative. And then it has a part three where it's going to repeat parts of part one and part two, but then give you the full, and that's where you get all of the details of what happens on the Day of Atonement. Climaxing with that point where the high priest goes in and cleanses the Holy of Holies, and in particular, the sprinkling of the blood of the sin offering on the mercy seat, the kipporet, and inside that. And then he moves from that point outside the altar. Why does he do that? He does that to cleanse the holy place because of the sins of the people. And then he moves outward. So there's a pivotal point in that narrative in part three of these parallel structures that, again, unfold in the narrative. So, again, one of the most common ways of telling a story, and in part there are aspects of this that can be seen in the various covenant passages. Look for those recurring themes that we have already talked about from Genesis chapter 12. Again, the issue of, God's call upon Abraham, that he's going to make his name great, he's going to make a great nation, he's going to give him the land, and the overall purpose is to be a blessing to all of humanity. Those themes come around in each of the major covenant passages that we've seen in chapters 15 and 17, and will be highlighted again in the material that we'll be looking at in our subsequent weeks. So, parallel structures, thematic development, again, that I've just described. In another way, you can look at parallel issues or expansion issues to take a theme such as covenant and how different aspects of God's special relationship, defined with the term covenant, with Abraham and ultimately with humanity, how those themes are brought forth in numerous settings. God reveals himself, again, it's a reminder, he reveals himself in real life situations. Not like God sits up there and says, okay, I've got this covenant idea that I want you all to understand. He deals with it in real life situations, in the life of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and so forth through Scripture. Number 5 in this analysis process is inclusio. Often a passage, a pericope is another fancy way we term a definable section of text, we use this word pericope, is started and concluded with a common element. It starts and ends the same. Most of you have probably seen the movie Forrest Gump. Remember the common thing at the beginning and the ending of Forrest Gump is this floating feather. That's the inclusio. And again, the difference between the young Forrest Gump on the bus, and then of course the son of Forrest Gump at the end getting on a bus, and you have the feather scene. That's an inclusio, an inclusion where you bracket the beginning and ending of a text by a common element. So sometimes, like I described with the Solomon material in 1 Kings 1 to 11, it's a combination of chiasm on a larger scale, what I sometimes refer to as a macro chiasmus versus minor. Sometimes you can have chiasm within a single verse. And you simply have reverse elements, like even a line of poetry in the Psalms. You can have A, B, and then B prime, A prime, where you reverse the elements. Maybe, a noun, verb, verb, noun. It's a very simple way of presenting a chiasmus in structure. And then other times we have mnemonic devices such as acrostics, and that's found primarily in the Psalms, some in short portions of book of Proverbs, but acrostics, assonance, and alliteration are other types of, again, devices that facilitate memory. And again, that can be like we talked about earlier, the repetition of, like in Psalm 23, these hierarchical endings. Another way, of course, is the use of metaphor and simile, comparative analogies, where you look at, again, the basic difference between a metaphor and a simile is whether you use like or as in the equation. There are other literary devices such as metonymy. Metonymy has to do with meta, that which accomplishes some sort of change, and then nomos. One nomos in Greek means law, but it's a change of name, metonymy. And that's a way of again, a rhetorical device typically done to change something from an honorable meaning to a dishonorable one. We have a number of names in Scripture. You remember Mephibosheth and Mephibaal. You have this character in the time of David, Mephibaal. Baal can mean the god Baal, but it's also a word that means honorable or can describe a lord or master. So it's a word of honor, whereas the name is changed to Mephibosheth. Bosheth is the Hebrew word for shame. So here you've had a name from honorable to dishonor. We had the same in Ishbosheth, a man of Ish, man of Bosheth, shame, and over against the same word usually comes over into English as Eth, E-T-H, Baal. Ishbosheth, Eth Baal, the same name, but one honorable, one dishonorable. And so these are typical prophetic devices in the prophetic literature of the Old Testament, whether the former prophets or the latter prophets, where you deliberately change the name in the text of Scripture to present this person. Again, this is part of characterization study from an honorable person to a dishonorable one. Probably the most illustrative is the name Jezebel. That's the way we say it in English. In Hebrew, it's written E, that Aleph with Hirik Yod, E, which is a particle of negation. Zaval or Zevel is another word of honor. No good Phoenician father or Hebrew father, for that matter, would name his daughter No Honor. And probably her original name was, most commentators that studied the use of metonymy would suggest that her name was originally a very common introductory element in Hebrew and in Phoenician names is Avi. So you in Hebrew, you actually change one letter. You drop out the bait of Av, father, Avi, my father, Avi, Zevel, my father is honorable. But by taking one letter out of Avizavel's name, you create Izavel, and you've made an honorable name into a dishonorable name, a name meaning no honor. So that's an aspect of metonymy, a way of, again, with narrative, literary effect, reducing a person from a state of honor to dishonor. Okay, so varieties of ways of the text. And then, of course, the second aspect of this portion of the study is, as I've been doing for you throughout the semester, doing a block diagram of the Hebrew text, looking at how, again, the common elements, whether it's the beginning of segments of a narrative with these Vav consecutive forms such as Vayomer, Vayehi, Vayadaber, and he spoke, or Vayakak, and he took, various ways where you segment the portions of the narrative into the series of events within the larger narrative structure. So again, the Vav consecutive imperfects, other times, like I described with the Psalms, nouns or verbs with the same suffix, ending, other ways that use common elements to sequence a narrative that is also giving it. And again, to look at these repetitious elements as you lay out your particular text in this part of your exegetical study. So just a reminder to note syntactical structures such as verb forms, the Vav consecutive, or what other grammarians refer to as a preterite, which is a fancy name for a past tense form. Sometimes it's sequence of imperatives. Sometimes, as we highlighted, we've seen a number of times where the use of the particle et, aleph with the segol tet, usually with the makef, connecting it with some element, the series of objects of a verb or objects of a prepositional phrase, and how these are done in sequence. Again, all of these is part of the narrative effect. And then as you look at these different elements to indent in your block layout of your Hebrew text, indent those various portions, which are subpoints in the major heading points. So in most cases where you have, we had a couple of times where we looked at these texts and, it began and ended, for example, in Clusio with a Vayehi. There might have been another Vayehi, and it came to pass, next phase of the narrative story, introduced by Vayehi. So, but other portions in between, say this is verse 1, verse 5, and verse 9, begin with Vayehi, but the others begin with, Vayakak, and he took, or Vayadaber, he spoke. And so to look at these substructures of your text layout. And again, it's a great way, you really see it in the Hebrew text of how the narration is shaped by the use of these various forms as you look at the laying out of the biblical text. So then and at the end of this section, I'll talk about how these elements are to be combined in the presentation of your paper. That you notice I moved the due date back to, Tuesday of next week, if you need the extra time. Now we'll look at the characterization study. There's a brief section, went too far, discussion of character and characterization in the narrative article. Again, various aspects of the characterization study. Number one, you want to look at the name. We have the change of name. So we talked about metonymy. Abram is changed to Abraham. Sarai is changed to Sarah. And then more dramatically, we have Jacob becoming Israel later on. I guess one of our students, Peter Schaffo, is doing the Jacob narrative where he wrestles with the angel at Penuel. But so you look at the name of the character and sometimes a change in name. Sometimes names are revealing. Sometimes they really don't tell you much about, but often the character of a person is revealed in their name. Very evident in the Jacob Israel naming process. So that's part one. Look at the name of the character. Then you want to look at the broader setting, the temporal setting, that is the time frame, historically speaking, what a name or a particular character type, how it fits into the larger world of time, geography, cultural practices. So we talk about this in the hermeneutics class of doing a background study. Time and space, history and geography, and cultural practices, the social context, issues of honor and dishonor. And then as you look at how is this particular character playing out in the larger story. So again, it's all part of how we look at how the narrator has shaped the character in the presentation of this particular aspect of the story of God's dealing with individuals in the storyline of his larger redemptive plan. One aspect of character study has to do with major characters versus minor characters, what we often refer to as a full character, such as an Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, and so forth, over against flat characters, those who just kind of play, you just get one little glimpse of a character. In many ways, though perhaps as we sometimes refer to it in literary study, the use of brief elements about a character like Melchizedek. We're not told much about Melchizedek's background other than he's a king, priest in Salem, who blesses Abraham, who receives tithes from Abraham, and that's it. We don't know about his background, how he got there, when he got there. Just he's there when Abraham comes back from the victory over the kings of Mesopotamia. So he is a somewhat flat character, but the lack of information gets exploited in history. So Melchizedek shows up in a whole new revelation in Psalm 110, and then of course the coup de grace, the use of that the Melchizedek narrative in the New Testament, particularly in the book of Hebrews. Other flat characters, would include a variety of individuals. There are a number of the sons of Jacob that are just kind of there in the story. When the brothers put Joseph in the well and eventually sell him into slavery, there's only a couple of his brothers that are playing a major role in that. The others are just kind of characters that are standing by. We don't learn a lot about Simeon. Even throughout the Old Testament, Simeon kind of disappears. Gets caught up in his territory, which is a sub-region of the larger territory of the tribe of Judah. So some characters are we call flat, but in looking at characterization, what you want to look at is how the flat characters or minor characters are employed in the presentation of the main storyline of your full character, your main characters. And then again, if you always want to come back in this to look at the most important character, that is God, in his relative revelatory plan in the narrative. So we want to look at, again, the fullness of character, positive elements, negative elements that are highlighted, again, as we've talked about in the life of Abraham, where he really gets it right, and then other times where he really gets it wrong. And so this is, again, the presentation of the larger meta-narrative of Scripture that, yes, Abraham is a great man of faith. From him will come many great nations. But he's far from a perfect individual because there are none, excepting Jesus, who are perfect characters in the narrative of Scripture. So then you look at how, again, the major and minor, full versus flat characters are employed in the narrative. Ellipsis has to do with what you're not told. There's a lot of ellipsis with regard to the character of Melchizedek. We know his name, we know his title and his role at one point in time in the story of Genesis 14. But sometimes those lack of or elliptical elements, what you're not told in the story, is used in the larger meta narrative of Scripture to bring about other kinds of revelatory statements in Scripture. With regard to the study of people like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, we need to look at what's described about Abraham maybe that's not told about in the life of Isaac or Esau or Jacob or Joseph. As you go through different characters of Scripture, ellipsis, things that are not told, and yet there are subtle points to be made in these aspects which are not revealed. And then, of course, like in the previous where we were talking about repetition, key terms or phrases that are utilized in the presentation of the character. Some of these may warrant additional word study. You're doing, Genesis 15, the issue of Abraham being reckoned as righteous. You may want to study the reckoning aspect and righteous and righteousness, those aspects, or other terminologies like the term covenant in the narrative, or other descriptors of the characters. How are they described, and then how are these key terms and phrases utilized by the narration to develop the full character presentation? And then finally, in the characterization study is, how does this person relate to God? God is the primary character of Scripture. So what does this divine human relationship tell us about the nature of God and his desire to bring about the redemption and the blessing of humanity? That's kind of the concluding aspects. So then you take those aspects, you're again starting with your translation, your literary analysis, and then you come back and bring it all together to present what theological and thematic aspects are highlighted by your analysis. How do the parts contribute to the presentation of God in relationship to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Ishmael, Sarai, Sarah, Hagar, Pharaoh of Egypt, or others? And how, again, bring all that material together to present how. So this is like a summary analysis. And then finally, says there, how does the shaping of the narrative highlight, when we talk about the use of rhetoric, the presentation of the key theological themes of the larger narrative, and then widen that. How does that contribute to our understanding of God in his redemptive plan of Genesis 12 to 36 in the patriarchal narrative? And then ultimately, a final word or sentence about how this contributes to the larger redemptive plan of God in our Christocentric world of interpretation. So, if you're familiar with or seen the Broadman and Holman has been doing a series of commentaries in the last few years that have to do with a Christ-centered exegesis of the text. What does, I've read a couple of these by Landon Dowden. Just sent back a review of his second one about, again, what does it tell us about the larger plan of God that came to fruition in history in the person and work of Christ? All right, just stop there.